the key aspect for me, and this is going back to the textbook, is very much about information. Markets work if both sides of the market, that is the buyers and the sellers, have information about what they want to buy or sell. And if there isn't that information available to both sides, then there's a clear market failure, because if information isn't available to both sides, then those both sides can't make the right decisions about how much to buy and how much to sell. So for this particular exercise, we're talking about trainees and we're talking about trainers. Now, do people out there, do the youngsters or even the people in the workforce already, or even the old people like me, do they have information about what sort of training they might need going into the future? And then there are the trainers or the employers. Do they have the information about what sort of training they need to provide going into the future? And you look at that balance and there's a clear imperfection in the market in that the trainers, the employers, are likely to know quite well what sort of training they want to provide. They are likely to know what sort of training or what sort of workforce they are going to need going into the future. Whereas the trainees at the other end of the spectrum are probably going to have little information. And so that's the market failure. In the jargon, we call it that asymmetric information, that imbalance in information. And I think ITOs have a core role in bridging that information gap and balancing up that flow of information. And so that's very much that ITO's role around being a conduit between the providers and the trainees and the trainers. There are a whole lot of free riders in industry that will basically say, "No, I don't want to do any training because I know somebody else will do the training for me and then I can pinch their people." And that's a market failure. And so, if that market failure exists quite strongly, then basically you have nobody investing in industry training, expecting everybody else to do the investment for them. And so that then provides a clear rationale for some public sector investment or some public sector role. So I'll just go through what we did and then go through the stories that come out of those results, because that's where the benefit of the modelling comes from, because it forces you to tell the story, and does the story make sense? Standard model, so we didn't invent anything new. Standard model, conventional, most economists will understand this sort of model, but 53 sectors, 40 different occupation types. In the baseline, let's say about 100,000 trainees and about 40,000 completions a year. Then we say, well, we generate what's called a BAU, or a business as usual scenario, and all that is that's the control experiment against which we're going to compare everything. So this is very much a laboratory type experiment where you have your person in your white coat. This is your control group, this is your controlled experiment. We're going to change something here and look what happens. And so we get a new scenario and then we're going to measure the difference between the control and the new. We assume industry training carries on as it has been in the past. So that's assumed, so that's our control group. And then we're going to make some changes to this control group and observe the differences. We're going to make the changes in 2012 and we're going to observe the changes 2 years later. We're going to refer to that as the short term, and then 9 years later, or 9 or 10 years later, out in 2021, and observe that as the longer term impacts. And we're going to look at two groups of changes. In one set of changes, we are going to look at a reduction in the investment in industry training. And in another set of scenarios, or another group of changes, we're going to look at an increase in the investment in industry training. In the first group, let's look at this first group of scenarios. And this is where we have no public funded industry training, or we have a reduction in investment in industry training, and then we have some variance. First one is a no public funded industry training, which leads to a reduction in completions. The important assumption in this first scenario is that industry doesn't respond accordingly. So industry continues to do its share of industry training as it has done in the past. So that's that sort of that controlled experiment. That stays the same. Industry training, industry investment in industry training continues. It's just the public sector investment is eliminated. Some variant scenarios that we think, well, when we say, well, what if industry funded training also declines, as well as the public funded investment? And that's what we label as another scenario, which we'll call in the labels D1. And another scenario where we say, well, all of this happens, but the public funds that were invested in industry training get respread or reallocated across the tertiary education sector. So so those are your sort of three scenarios that we want to observe. And this is the headline numbers in terms of that set where we're looking at a reduction in investment in industry training. The red bars are the long term, so that's the 2021 impact, and the blue bars is the short term. Okay, so that's the 2014 impact. And the three groups, that's scenario D0, so that's where we reduce public sector funded industry training, but industry remains in the game. This one where we reduce both public and industry funds into industry training, and this one over here is when we respread the public dollars to other bits of tertiary education. This is the impact on GDP compared to our control path or compared to our business as usual. And what we find, well, the worst case scenario, okay, so that's where both public and industry step out of the game. And over the long term, you're looking at about 6% loss in GDP. Over the short term, yeah, not quite 2%, about 1.5% loss in GDP. That's the big one. Even if public steps out on its own, but industry carries on, you're looking at about what, not quite 4% over the long term. That's a sizable shock to GDP. These translate to about 1.2 billion annual GDP to about 7 billion annual GDP. But that's sort of half the story, and I think what the really important part of the story, rather than that headline numbers, is how that impact is made up. And I think the biggest one that I draw your attention to are these brown bars in this slide, and that's the impact on exports, because that's the big hit. And why does exports get impacted the most? And I think this is the critical thing about how the modelling results start forming the story and actually informing how does this reduction in investment in industry training flow on to an impact on the overall economy. Reducing the investment in industry training reduces the available supply of trained labour. Okay, so that's a quantity effect. So then firms and sectors and firms and industries have a reduced amount of labour to play with, a reduced amount of trained labour, so they can't produce as much. So that's a reduction in their production levels. So that makes sense. So they can't produce as much, so they can't sell as much. So you get an impact on GDP on that. But the other critical effect is not only is a reduction in how much you can produce, but the trained labour that is still available increases in cost because it's now in short supply. So that firms not only are facing a reduced ability to produce, they are now facing an increase in costs of the labour that they still have to have available to them. And that increase in cost hurts exporters the most, because those are the ones that have to compete in cost terms with those people abroad, those firms that they're competing with in the world market. And so those are the ones that get hurt the most. Whereas firms competing or firms producing for domestic, they get hurt a little bit, but nowhere near as much. And so that's the critical element. Note that that scenario D2, when the funds are redistributed across tertiary education, you still get a net negative impact on the overall economy. And that's because the dollars per completion to other areas of the tertiary education are greater than for industry training. So while industry training loses and other areas of tertiary education win, the overall net impact for the New Zealand economy is negative. Okay, so just reinforcing the industry perspective of the modelling results, adding up our 53 industries into three groups: primary, manufacturing and services. And what we find is that the manufacturing sector gets hit the most. And that's not surprising, because manufacturing sector is the one where industry training is most heavily involved in. And also significant chunks of the manufacturing sector are export orientated. Similarly, primary sector also hurt. Again, also significant impacts on industry training and also export dominated. The service sector we find not so much hurt, primarily because industry training isn't a big proportion of their workforce in the service industry, but also service industries, and when you look at the whole broad spectrum of them, not as much export orientated as other sectors. The other angle we can look at this is by occupation, and this is interesting because we add up our 40 occupations into five different groups. And the one that I draw your attention to is this lighter blue line, which is the elementary skilled labour category. In the olden days, I used to call that unskilled blue collar. What the model is telling us is that the model needs that type of labour as well as all the other types of labour. And what the model is telling me, or what the training data is telling me, is that there is a fair amount of training occurring across all those categories, and in particular across elementary skilled labour. So while it's elementary skilled, or even if you call it unskilled, it's not untrained. Those skills still need training, because what's this telling us? If industry or if public sector withdraw from industry training, this category gets hurt the most. And this category is needed by the model across all those industries, and definitely across those export industries. This one here, that's when we reallocate funds to other areas of the tertiary education sector. So yes, we get some more professionals, but that doesn't outweigh the losses in the other occupation categories. Turning to the increase in investment in industry training, and we again have a couple of variants. We increase public funded industry training, and leads to an increase in completions across the categories of occupations that we have. And then we look at targeting some of the increase, because this increase is just, the I0 increase is across all categories pro rata as current. Okay, so we assume industry training continues in the sectors that we currently do it to the same degree. This one, well, let's focus our increased effort on industry training consistent with what's labelled the EGA, or what's known as the Economic Growth Agenda of government. And that's primarily focused on exports. And the other scenario is, let's focus our increased effort on industry training on those sectors that are consistent with the tertiary education strategy. So those are the ones training the under 25s, Māori, Pacifica. And as well as focus on those sectors that are consistent with the need to rebuild Christchurch. The message here is that it's relatively dull and uninteresting, actually. It's a boring picture. The vertical axis is a lot less. The gains for an increase in industry training are smaller than the losses if we reduced industry training. So it's not symmetrical. Because remember, the losses we were talking about, 5 to 6%, the gains are under 1%. Why are the gains so much less? Well, because we're constrained by the amount of labour available to train.
So are you saying we don't need increased investment in industry training?
No, I'm not saying that at all. The model is actually giving us benefits to an increase in investment in industry training. All the model is saying is that those benefits aren't as great as the losses if we reduced. Within particular industries, there may be arguments for increased industry training. The modelling just suggests that there's not a strong argument for a significantly increase in the scale of industry training. So there's no argument for a doubling, for example. The story and the messages are very similar at the macro level. I suppose in terms of exports, you do get the gains, while at the GDP level are small, the exports do gain most. Between the scenarios, if we focus on the exports, even with an economic growth agenda, the difference between those two is relatively small. So the effort and focus doesn't seem to give you much more. If you focus on TES and the need to rebuild Christchurch, exports don't gain as much, but there's a lot more required in terms of the investment category of GDP. Targeting specific industries, whether it's export or whether it's TES, tertiary education strategy, or whether it's targeting the building sector for rebuilding Christchurch, doesn't give you much difference at the macro level, but the gains are different at the sector level and definitely at the occupation level. Manufacturing sector, definitely much bigger gain if you're focusing on exports. The key gain, the key difference across the occupation categories when we start talking about targeting, and this is the big one. Remember this scenario, that middle scenario, I2, was when we were focusing on the economic growth agenda, we were focusing on exports, we were focusing on those competitive industries that are out there trying to make it in the nasty, cruel world. Which occupations are needed most? It's this light blue one. That one, that elementary skilled labour. What's it telling me? It's telling me the model needs labour across all categories, definitely needs labour in here. That labour needs to be trained, because if it's not trained it won't be showing up in this model. And it needs it for export purposes. But the message out of doing these different experiments is just to reinforce that argument that elementary skilled labour is not unskilled, is not untrained, and is not unproductive. The scenario where we focus on rebuilding Christchurch and tertiary education strategy, you obviously clearly get the focus on skilled labour and building labour, and that's obvious. But again, I reinforce at the big picture GDP macro level, it doesn't make a big difference. Just some concluding comments in terms of what we find. Confirmation that industry training provides a benefit to the New Zealand economy at that macro level, with some interesting sector and occupation stories. Confirms that the economy needs skills, trained skills of all types across all of the 40 categories of occupations that we've got in our model. And I think it's what we need to get out there is to get the message that irrespective of skills, all those skills need training. And irrespective of that level of skill, trained means productivity. Even elementary skills do not equate to low productivity, as the model is showing. And then the final point that I'd make is to ensure that we've pushed the model is giving us the outcomes of increasing the number of completions. That's basically it. And it's probably reinforcing to public sector officials that completions is probably not the appropriate measure of industry training contribution. The appropriate measure is the outcome. And what is the outcome? It's what the model is telling us is those long-term gains to the broader economy, whether you measure it in GDP or in exports or in employment across all of those occupations. That's the outcome. The output is completions, and yes, you might want to measure how many completions you are doing, but let's not lose sight of the bigger picture or that wider key measure, which is the outcome to the New Zealand economy, whether you measure it in terms of GDP or in terms of exports.
Ganesh, for industries where success is measured more by social outcomes rather than economic outcomes, what can they learn from this research?
You still need social outcomes, it's just they're more difficult to measure. But let's not forget that GDP measures the outputs of all sectors and all profit-making as well as non-profit-making organisations. So whether it's education or health or even in the retail trade or other areas of the service sector, the social outcomes may be their measure, but from an economist's perspective, it comes through in the measure of GDP. So while GDP is an economist's measure, it does capture the outcomes and outputs coming from the service sector. Efforts in trying to target training dollars to particular industries may be missing the point. The point is very much that that an economy as diverse as New Zealand's needs labour across all skill types, across all occupation types.